whether Marx says stuff about ecology per se was not that interesting to me, or it's not what I wanted to think about. It was more like, how do I use some of Marx's own method and way of thinking about capitalism and analyzing capitalism and criticizing some of the dominant economic frameworks of his time, and can we use those sort of tools to think about our present moment and the kind of political economies of nature today and of climate change and all of these kinds of things.
Hello and welcome to Urgent Futures, the show that finds signal in the noise. I'm your host, Jesse Damiani. I'm a writer, curator, and professor who's on a continual quest to learn about reality and how it's evolving. Each week, I sit down with leading thinkers whose research, concepts, and questions clarify the chaos, from culture to the cosmos. My guest this week is Alyssa Battistoni. Alyssa Battistoni is assistant professor of political science at Barnard College. She is the co-author of A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal. Her writing has appeared in The Nation, The Guardian, Boston Review, N+1, Dissent, The New Statesman, Jacobin, and New Left Review. Alyssa's latest book is called Free Gifts: Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. And yes, you need to read this thing. It's a searing, imminently readable breakdown of how and why capitalism is incapable of valuing nature, treating it instead as a, quote, free gift. I've had folks on the show before talking about ecosystem services. Check out my conversations with Paul R. Ehrlich, Gerardo Ceballos, and Rodolfo Dirzo as starting points. And while Free Gifts addresses those ideas too, it goes much deeper. It's not merely that what we call nature provides countless services that never get factored into the economy. It's that the incentives of capitalism are fundamentally antithetical to human beings living sustainably on this planet. In the book, she conducts Marxist feminist analysis on how we got here, what it means for us, and ultimately drives us toward the necessary changes we must make if we want to survive. She reveals how, by treating nature as free, capitalism ultimately diminishes human freedom. It bars us from making truly ethical choices in how we value and relate to the more than human world. A quick related reminder: all the messy politics you're witnessing right now, such as rising authoritarianism, is downstream of our economic system, which determines the shape of what is possible. Alyssa's work reveals how entangled our economic systems are in everything from social systems to individual choices, and it's an absolutely critical time to contend with that. So without further ado, please enjoy this robust conversation with Alyssa Battistoni. All right, well, I am joined today by Professor Alyssa Battistoni. Professor Battistoni, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we are gathered today to discuss your superb new book, Free Gifts, holding it up for folks who are watching this podcast. And this book really, I went in kind of getting the gist, or I felt like I did. But as I went deeper, the profundity kept revealing itself. So first of all, I just want to thank you for this book. And second of all, if you could describe what you're referring to when you refer to the free gift.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much. It's really nice to hear that, and I am thrilled. Yeah, just thrilled that you enjoyed it and that it felt like it went beyond what you thought you might get with a, I guess there are many critiques of capitalism out there. But yeah, the free gift is a term that is actually not mine originally. It's something that I take from classical political economy and Marx's critique of it. So a lot of classical political economists in the 18th and 19th centuries, people like David Ricardo and Jean-Baptiste and Adam Smith, write about the gratuitous contributions of these natural agents to production. They write about sheep organs and wind that blows sails and steam and all of these sorts of non-human entities that contribute to production, and they remark on how they do this generously and for free and all of these kinds of amazing qualities. And it's generally a pretty kind of celebratory tenor. And then Marx has this critique of them, and Marx is very critical of the classical political economists on many fronts, and so he's quite rude about them in a bunch of places, but he's just kind of like these idiots don't understand that this isn't just producing wealth. These natural agents are only giving to capital. Capitalists own the means of production. They're capturing all the productivity gains. They're the only ones reaping the benefits of these gifts of nature. So these are free gifts to capital only, he says. And that is both, I think, very much in line with his general critique of classical political economy, that they're kind of not paying enough attention to capitalism per se. But he also doesn't say very much more about the free gift. And it's actually, I think, a very interesting and strange concept when you think about it. So I wanted to sort of explore it more, because a gift is free, either definitionally or it's sort of contradictory, because gifts, you don't buy and sell them. That's kind of like the point of a gift. You're not buying it. You are receiving it through another kind of social mechanism. So on the one hand, it's just kind of like, yeah, of course, gifts is free. But on the other hand, there's a long tradition of thinking of gifts as reciprocal, of thinking them as these sorts of things that, if somebody gives you a gift and you have to return the gift, you owe them something, you need to reciprocate that gift to them. And many cultures that are organized primarily on gifts, that's sort of just foundational. So in that sense, the free gift doesn't really make sense. And so the free gift, I think, is this sort of strange concept that I think actually points us to thinking about the particular kind of free that is relevant in a capitalist society and capitalist world in particular, which is this costlessness or usefulness that's costless, that doesn't have a price, and elements of, in this case, the natural world, the non-human world, that are very useful, sometimes invaluable. They're incredibly important for the maintenance of, not only for production, but for the maintenance of like life on Earth. But they have no value in the sort of, economic sense of the term. They don't appear in the form of price. They don't sort of show up in the terms that capital can see. And so they just kind of vanish from our dominant modes of accounting. And so that's what the free gift tries to describe, this sort of strange phenomenon. And then all of the things that result from that condition.
Amazing. Yeah, you started to talk about what I wanted to ask you next, which is you talk about how, as you said, Marx takes some of these other thinkers to task, and there are even ecological considerations that we find in Marx, but that there's also a lot of places that, as you say, go curiously underexplored. So I'd love if we could go a little bit deeper in terms of what you found when you were doing research, in terms of those gaps and in terms of basically what was said and what wasn't said, and maybe some of the conclusions that you drew.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Marx is an interesting person to think about with respect to ecology, because on the one hand, like he has often been seen as kind of an anti-ecological figure. A long tradition of environmentalists and environmental thinkers have, seen Marx as just this Promethean modernist. He's just out to, he wants to develop the productive forces and seize the industrial means of production and put them to work for the socialist or communist society, but he doesn't want to like dismantle them, or he doesn't seem to have the kind of critique that many ecological thinkers would make of the destruction of nature. But he has been, in recent years, people like Kohei Saito, the Japanese Marxist scholar, who's published, the best-selling Marx in the Anthropocene and most recently Slow Down, has shown all these places where Marx is actually talking about like soil fertility, or ecological effects of certain kinds of production or farming, or where he's attentive to the things we now think of as being like environmental issues. I think that stuff is all great. What I in some ways was interested in things that Marx left out, but not because I wanted to say like, oh, Marx didn't talk about this, that means he's anti-ecological, or he did talk about this, and that means that he's like an environmentalist and he had it all figured out, back in, when he's writing in the mid-19th century. In some ways, like whether Marx says stuff about ecology per se was not that interesting to me, or it's not what I wanted to think about. It was more like, how do I use some of Marx's own method and way of thinking about capitalism and analyzing capitalism and criticizing some of the dominant economic frameworks of his time, and can we use those sort of tools to think about our present moment and the kind of political economies of nature today and of climate change and all of these kinds of things. That said, there are definitely places where I think it's striking, again, like this where he talks about the free gift, and then a lot of eco-Marxists or people who are working in a socialist or Marxist tradition will use this phrase, but they never kind of explore it. And then, that kind of opened up a bunch of questions for me, like what are these things that have what Marx calls use value, that are useful but not don't have exchange value? They don't have, they're useful but they don't have price. Um, and why, why doesn't he talk about those more? There's a lot of that in the world. There are a lot of things that don't end up getting commodified, and they're significant, both in kind of, our daily lives, but they also matter for aspects of capitalism, for how we understand capitalism. There are things like, I have a chapter on pollution, which I think it's really interesting that Marx says almost nothing about. He talks a little bit about some of like the filth in the rivers and things, but he doesn't really have an analysis of, kind of these like coal smoke fogs that are enveloping London at the time when he's sitting in the British Library writing Capital. So there are a lot of things that I think Marx doesn't talk about, and that's not, it's not like, oh well, then Marx is like useless because he didn't say XYZ, because I don't want to say, well, whatever he said, that's what our environmental program is. It doesn't matter to me that much. It's more like, what are these weird little patches and absences and silences, and what actually is going on there? And that seems to me like a fruitful area for people working today to be thinking through and trying to understand differently.
Amazing. Thank you. Some of the questions that follow are going to be framed maybe like overly elementarily. So please forgive me for that. That's what I'm trying to do, is kind of tease this out for folks who don't spend their time thinking about political theory and capitalism. You
Great.
brought up use value and exchange value. Could you sketch, let's call it like a very broad view, though take as long as you'd like, because it's a massive topic, how capitalism conditions our senses of value? And maybe along the way, if you could describe what these different forms of value are, again, for folks who maybe,
Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely, definitely. And it's a good question. And these are things that, there's no reason you would just be familiar with a lot of these concepts. So, yeah, use and exchange value are sort of just is the basic distinction Marx makes in thinking about the commodity. And he talks about, he starts off capital by saying the commodity is capitalism's elementary social form. It's like the core unit in some way. And it's characterized by these two forms of value. So use value is like, it's how you use the thing. It's kind of what it sounds like, right? It's like, it's its physical qualities. He sometimes talks about it as its natural form. It's like concrete. So like, you have a table and it's made of wood and it's useful for putting your dinner on, or like whatever it may be. And that's its use value. And you want to, you want this table so that you can have your friends over to dinner and put stuff on it. But its exchange value is not really connected to any of those things, or its exchange value is like its price. It's this number. It's this abstract quantity. It's not really particularly reflective of any of the qualities. I mean, like they might go into it, but it's not. It's detached in this other sort of realm, and its price, it might cost the same amount as like a pair of shoes, or I don't know, like a lot of books. I don't know. I guess it depends on like what all of these particular things are, but it has the same price as a bunch of other things that are like very, very different in their qualitative aspects, that are like have been made in different ways, that are made of different stuff that you can use for different things. And so he wants to separate these things out and think about how it is that all of these sorts of entities in the world that are really different end up sort of circulating in this form of exchange value, and how that becomes sort of this dominant way that we perceive and understand the world. And he's really interested, both Marx and then later Marxist thinkers, I think, are very interested in how it is that we come to see kind of all of social life through the commodity, in a sense, or that becomes this dominant experience of social life, is like when we need to, and then in many ways this comes out more in later thinkers, but that, when we obviously use things all the time, so we experience a lot of our lives in the terms of use value of like interacting with our stuff. But to do almost anything in the world, you have to kind of also engage in that exchange relation, right? Like if I want to go see a movie, I take the subway, I have to pay for the subway. I go in, I buy a ticket to go see the movie. I like watch the movie, maybe I buy some popcorn because I'm hungry. Like at each point, I'm just, my use value is I want to have a nice evening out and like see this new film by a director I like. And the way that I actually do all of those is by like, paying for it, by trading this, in terms of money by kind of engaging in this very abstract field that allows me access to all of these concrete actual experiences and goods and services and so on. And so, the question is like, I think one of the questions, that Marx has, that other Marxists have had, that this book has, is like how do we then come to relate to each other and to the world primarily in these terms, and what gets distorted when we sort of forget all of the valuable things, or things that are valuable in other ways, or things that are not that don't have a price, or where the price doesn't seem to fit how valuable or important or significant or meaningful or useful or whatever the thing may be. And one of the key things for Marx too is to remember that use value and exchange value like are not exchange value is does not necessarily reflect like what we think something, you know, the value something should have. And there are a huge number of range of other ways of thinking about value. And I guess one last thing I'd say is I think sometimes people tend to equate use value with like almost instrumentalism. And I think that can be like, it's called use, so it's about using things, but it can be pretty expansive. Like the use value of like a tree can be that you like to sit under it, or that you like to look at it, or that you want to know it exists even if you've never been, there's like a tree somewhere in the Amazon that you want to know exists even if you're like not ever planning to go. So there are many ways to think about use value that actually encapsulate many aspects of like what we think of as ethical value or moral value, or things that we talk about in this more philosophical register of like what our values are and like what they could be. And that those are not necessarily like opposed to use value. You don't have to like use the tree just by like chopping it down and making it into a table. You could also just hang out with the tree, and that could be its use too. So so that's, I guess, the basic way I want to think about it. And then I'm trying to sort of suggest, I think that we actually often do think about, even though we are conditioned to think about things in terms of exchange value, or that's kind of the way we interact with most stuff and other people as well. We actually do also have all these other ways of thinking about what is and should be valuable that are sometimes confusing when you're like, what's the gap here? Why are these not aligned?
Mm. Yeah, and you hit on something that I love about this book, which is the way that you thread those two, not the two sort of Marxist framings of value, but the value in terms of how it manifests economically, but also what does that mean in our values, in our lives, in the world. And so I'll frame it from, you sort of take a particular way of thinking to task. So I'll frame it from that adversarial frame. So you talk about how pricing leaves out so much, and it also offsets harm in the form of externalities. So there's going to be some people that say, well, why can't we just apply a price to everything? What is it about that framing that doesn't work?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things that don't work. And one is on the more like, I guess one could think of as a more like moral register or value register, and the other is a more practical problem. And so one is, and this is, I think, a common critique of the idea of pricing everything, which people will say, okay, so like, these what are often called ecosystem services that keep the planet habitable, like the carbon cycle, or I don't know, water filtration, various things that like ecosystems do that are necessary to keep both individual biospheres functioning and provide things that people rely on, but also to keep our general planetary biosphere stable and you know continuing to support the conditions of life as we know it and things like that. Why not just we'll try to estimate the value of these things in economic terms. We recognize that they're not priced, so like how can we estimate that? And a lot of the critique has been that is sort of immoral, because it can't adequately reflect the value of that non-human nature has, that there's something, that either the other kinds of life have intrinsic value, that they have some kind of emotional or spiritual value, that they have these kinds of, again, like moral registers that can't be captured by prices, and that shouldn't be captured by prices. That there's something that's kind of like degrading about it to say, well, okay, that whale, and there is this great study of how much a whale is worth. Like that whale is worth like $2 million, and that's it. It seems to be sort of like this, again, it like almost devalues the thing by putting the price on it. And I think that's actually like I'm often very sympathetic to these. I think that's like true in a bunch of ways. But I think that's true of all the things that we price also. Like the things that we put prices on are not necessarily, like we already do put prices on a ton of things that aren't necessarily reflecting like what we think, how important they are, or how like, meaningful, or like socially significant, or like what their priority in the list of like human needs is. You can look at any kind of given, like, I don't know what like basic food goods versus like luxury handbags. Like obviously like the prices of things are not correlated to their something that's significant in the world. And that's we can just recognize that, and I think that critique is fine, but you need to extend it a lot further than you would than those critiques often do. So there's a problem with like just generally translating the expectation that price would reflect something about what again, like moral, ethical, social value something has. But there's also just a problem that is like actually just like practically extremely difficult, and I would say impossible to price a lot of these things. Um, because one of the things I argue in the book is that the only way that nature can enter into these sorts of realm of prices and being visible to markets and to capital, is when it's in the form of property. When it has like a human owner who can engage in market exchange and sort of say, well, I own this forest, and if you want to use it, you have to pay me XYZ. And this is where actually it becomes quite significant that it's very difficult to make many of these things into property. Like a lot of them are just incredibly difficult to kind of yeah, to exert control over in the way that you would have to in order to get people to pay you to use them. Like you can't just say, well, you have to pay me to breathe air now. Tough. It's at least not on Earth. There is a libertarian science fiction where they do imagine that, called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where that's sort of like the model is you have to pay for oxygen, but that's because it's an oxygenless atmosphere. On Earth, you can just breathe for free. So there are some gifts that are basically like too free. They're too generous. Economists talk about this as public goods. But this is, I think, this more significant problem than has often been recognized as well, because there are so many things actually that are like very difficult for private owners to exert that kind of control over, and extract like payment and rents from, and then more than that, to make into sort of sources of profit and income, which is the reason that you would, in a capitalist society, that you would sort of like invest in and protect these things, as if they're going to generate some kind of economic value for you. And it's very difficult to do that with quite a lot of elements of the non-human world, and so they end up there's been all of this anxiety that we're going to commodify all of nature, that like every last like being on Earth is going to be turned into a commodity, and that's just not true at all. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. A lot of them are just going to be left out, but that's also a problem.
Mm. And of course, we've seen the problems that have emerged from applying price to the commodities that we have designated. It also speaks to the ways that capitalism drives us toward individualized, alienated ways of relating, as opposed to, kind of some of what you're arguing. Maybe I'll leave it there and get your response on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is another difficulty, is that the model of decision making that I think is predominant in capitalist societies, or I guess there are two. And so one is that the people who own, who own the means of production, capitalists, decide what they're going to do with that stuff. They own it, so they decide like what they're making, and how much, and all of that stuff. So they make really important decisions about like production and like the stuff we're making and using as a society. And that's like a private decision made by the small number of people. But then there's also the way we make decisions kind of collectively is mostly through the market and through the aggregation of all of our individual choices. Like that is sort of the theory of the market that people like Friedrich Hayek in particular defend, which is that, we are each kind of free to value whatever matters most to us. I can spend my money on like books or like candy bars or whatever, and whatever I do is going to like show what my priorities are, and that's going to be like that's what I value most in my life, and nobody else should tell me what that is, but like that's up to me, but that's sort of like the realm where my decision making and sort of freedom exists. But then there's the way we kind of make decisions as a collective is basically just like everyone does their own individual little thing, and then the market kind of just aggregates all of those into collective decisions about like what's going where, what resources are being used, and that's supposed to be for Hayek, that's supposed to be a good thing, like a solution to the problem of not having enough information about any given thing. But I think what it actually does is it makes it incredibly difficult to make real decisions on a collective and social basis about like what we as a society, as a community, as in the sense like a planet, think is valuable and want to preserve and protect, because it's very, there's no way of communicating about those decisions or thinking about what will happen if everyone does this individually. We are often under certain kinds of pressure to make decisions, to always pick the cheapest thing because you only, your wage only goes so far. And maybe, that means that you pick the thing that, is like really ecologically destructive, but you don't have that much money, so you just keep doing it anyway. And when everyone's individual choices are added up, it's not like everyone's like, oh, I actually just like don't give a shit about, what's happening to the rainforest or the wetlands or the oceans or whatever. It's just that these are the very limited choices available to you. Most of what's happening is hidden from you. You don't really know. You're just supposed to go out there and buy whatever you can and buy the cheapest stuff you can. And so that it's a mode of decision making that is not, it's exactly as you said, individualized and alienated. It's not a genuine social process or political process or way that we can actually like prioritize some things over others. And then we end up looking around and saying, how did this happen? Why? Like, how is it that we're basically, overheating the entire planet? Like, how have some of these things come to pass? There's a sense of like helplessness, but it's because we can't do very much about it in this mode of, the way we make most of our decisions, which again is just by like going around and buying stuff. Like you vote a couple times a year. Most of the time, you're just going out like buying shit, and that's how you're sort of interacting and producing the broader decisions of our world.
Mm. Yeah, as a leftist, I was really struck by the moment where you described the ways that even the wealthy are unfree under this system, really highlighting how it really is a system. Because obviously, I'm so predisposed to sort of hold, billionaires and oil companies and banks accountable for, or most accountable. But of course, as you identified, this is a system. And so you also brought up freedom and you brought up Hayek. So I feel like this is a good point to talk about the sort of register of freedom / unfreedom that emerges under capitalism, and what's the dialogue that you're creating between Sartre and Hayek.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I am glad you like that part because I do think it's really important that it's not just about not having more money, or that like if you had more money you could buy whatever you wanted, and it's not just like not being able to buy anything or access anything. It's that even if you are really wealthy, or even if you are like a CEO, or even if you own a bunch of companies and you have some control over like production and things like that, you don't really have that much choice in what you're doing a lot of the time, or you have very limited you're acting under quite serious constraints, and with these various forms of compulsion, and Marx talks about these as mute compulsions, but these ways that you're driven to do certain things, because if you're a capitalist, you have to like outcompete your whoever your competitor is, you have to sell more stuff at a lower price than them. You have to make more profit, or they're gonna, run you out of business. And you're just gonna, you're not gonna literally die as a person, but your company might. And there's a similar dynamic that happens. There's something like that kind of competitive pressure is not that different with, capitalists who are trying to beat each other out to make profits on workers who are trying to get a job that they need to survive. And the conditions and situations and things are very different, but a lot of that kind of like compulsive quality is not. And so I think it does really affect everyone in some way. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't still, like focus our ire and political critiques on the billionaires and oil companies, because they also do a lot of stuff that we can hold them accountable for. But I think it's important to understand that it's not just like these guys are like bad guys. These are like some like greedy executives or like some greedy capitalists. It's like, well, they basically have to do a lot of this stuff. And so what I want to do is, this is I think one of the unusual moves of the book, but I have a critique of Hayek's view of the freedom or the market as like the space of freedom, and he has this kind of famous defense of market freedom and of the freedom to like choose your values in the market. Milton Friedman also writes with Rose Friedman a book called Free to Choose, and this kind of idea of like choice, market choice, and the freedom to choose is sort of like the pinnacle of like capitalist freedom. I think is very widespread, and it was really popularized by Hayek and Friedman and others. And so that's kind of what we think of as like that's like capitalist freedom. It's like choice, and I think on the left the tendency is to criticize that as being this like bad freedom, which it is in that version. I agree, but I think what I want to do is say like actually they're not even able to deliver on that. Like capitalism doesn't actually permit real choices about our values. It doesn't permit us to actually like make the kinds of choices that someone like Hayek is suggesting that it does. And so we're not actually free in the sense that we've been told capitalism promotes. We're not free to make these like uncoerced decisions. And that actually there's something that we should defend about the freedom to choose like our values and what matters to us, and to have a suspicion that I think Hayek is right to have of when those values are imposed by someone else. So I'm like, yeah, if the state just tells you this is what the values are, like you want to be reflexive about that, and maybe sometimes you're like, yes, I totally endorse these, and other times you're like, no, I don't. So obviously there's something to even his very strong anti-state animosity that I think we want to hold on to and direct also at other kinds of potentially traditional or conservative or oppressive institutions that hand down like a set of like practices and values, and we have to decide like, are these good? Do we want to affirm these? And that's what I get from Sartre and from existentialism, is this idea that yeah, at the end of the day, we are, we as human beings are responsible for the values we like live and uphold in the world. Like we can't just offload them onto like, well, this is what my religion tells me or God tells me, or this is what I get this from nature, or somebody else, like social practices, this is what's normal. You can't just say this is like what I've been told to do. You have to think for yourself about what you think is valuable and right and good in the world, and then like go out and try to make that like commit yourself to it and try to live your life in a way that reflects that. And that can be kind of an individualist model in some instances, but I think that there's a way to think of that as like a more collective or social project. Like that is what we should do. I think it's a good thing to have to, again, to reflect on and decide what you think is important and worth doing and what matters and has meaning in your life and collective life. And I want to defend that and to say, choice is good, and the freedom to choose values and like articulate why and things like that. These are good things, and we need to do them in a more genuine way. And it's very very difficult in this form of in capitalist societies, and in this form of like alienated market relation that is dominant within them, to genuinely do that, which is why we feel so like often detached from like the consequences of these actions, where we're like looking around and saying, how did this happen? Like we didn't mean to do this. what can we possibly do about it? There's something that feels very alien and alienating about it because they are markets are basically detaching our acts from sort of the consequences they have in the world, and that's part of like how they operate.
Yeah, I mean, that leads perfectly into what I was kind of brimming with as you were talking, because it's like maybe an overly simplistic way of sort of reflecting back what I took from the book and taking from this conversation is capitalism has a very narrow menu, and the entries on that menu are only reflected in price, and that menu discounts all the other things that could be on that menu. And it's going to be messy if we God forbid are lucky enough to break capitalism and survive as a species, both of which are things that are very much in question. Breaking that menu broad, we're not going to immediately go to an infinite menu where we've like escaped the tyranny of commodities and prices. There have to be these other ways of thinking that might be imperfect, a la Sartre and existentialism, that reshape our thinking such that we can even begin to imagine that we need kind of this other this other section of the menu that then leads us to the next section of the menu, and so on. And thinking about those offset harms, you use the example of pollution. So I'd love if you could speak to what pollution tells us about what capitalism is and is not capable of, and particularly how individuals don't have a lot of options on that menu to participate in curbing pollution.
Yeah, definitely. Pollution, yeah, like I mentioned, is this interesting and weird phenomenon I've come to think. One that, like, as I mentioned, Marx doesn't say very much about Engels. Friedrich Engels, so sometimes co-author, does talk more about pollution in his book about the working class in Manchester. But, in general, it's not something there's like not a lot of sustained attention to until really the 20th century. But I think it's kind of a weird phenomenon in general, but maybe especially for like political economy or Marxists or socialists who are used to thinking about things in terms of like production and commodity production as being this major I guess like way to analyze the world, because pollution is basically just like the stuff that comes out when you produce commodities. It comes out of the same process as like the commodity, but it's like this useless and usually not even useless, like actively harmful like stuff. No one wants it. Like you make like a car and people want to buy the car, but then there's all this other like crap that basically comes out of like when because you're transforming this matter of the world. You're putting in like I don't know, like iron and rubber and all of these kinds of different like physical entities. You're transforming their shape, you're changing their qualities, you're blending them with one another, whatever, and that makes new things with amazing new qualities, and also makes a bunch of like other stuff. And I talk about that as like surplus matter. Basically, it's like this like just like this physical stuff that is often pretty toxic to humans and other kinds of life, is not something that anyone really wants to have around, but it has to go somewhere. So often it's just kind of like dumped on whoever is around. Like if you're you own the company, you're going to try and get rid of that stuff as easily and cheaply as possible. Often that's meant just like literally just dumping it into like the river, the ocean, or the letting the smoke come out of the chimney, and letting whoever is nearby just deal with it. And this has been, I think, discussed. Often there's one set of a way of thinking about it in economics that describes this as an externality, like pollution is like anything else, just like an unpriced good, basically, or it's like another thing that doesn't have a price, and that's a problem with it. And like I think on the left, and then kind of like environmental discourses is often talked about as an environmental justice issue, where it's like the problem is that these things are distributed unevenly, and some people bear more burden than others. Usually, like working class people, communities of color, like bear a lot more of the burden. Which is definitely true, just like empirically unequivocally correct. But what I want to do is just kind of like go back to that production moment and be like, we can't just talk about the distribution of these effects. We have to like understand what's going on, like how it's possible that these or like why this is happening. And I do think it's really important to think about not only that moment of this is coming out of commodity production that is again controlled by people who own the means of production, even if they are also being compelled to produce in certain ways, and they are usually being compelled to again produce as cheaply as possible, so not to invest in like like filtration devices or things that will curb, that will limit the amount of smoke or carbon or whatever, because they're not making any extra money when they do that. They're just making their process more expensive, and they're not, it's not making more stuff faster or anything like that. Um, that there's reasons that capitalists aren't investing in those, but they're still not, and they're going to try and offload this stuff as cheaply as possible. And what they're able to do, I think, in this kind of class society is basically it is about it is thinking about we have to think about these like power relations that make it possible for people who have social power and who have class power to impose that to impose those that excess matter that is harmful and toxic and whatever on other people without their consent usually. It's just kind of a it's they that the people who are being subjected to these forms of pollution usually have very little say in the matter. But even if they did, like even if you can imagine they had to negotiate some kind of contract with the company to like let them dump in the river or put smoke in the air or whatever, people would probably end up selling that right to do that very cheaply, just like people sell their labor very cheaply and go work in very different, and really dangerous jobs and workplaces and work sites. And, in any system where some people are just dependent on others for the basic things they need to live, and they need to earn a wage, they need to earn money, they need to, have access to this medium of exchange so they can get all the stuff they need. They're going to end up in positions where they're very likely to enter into harmful and exploitative situations because they have very few other options. So, it's basically the chapter's trying to say, like, we need to think about production, think about why, even if people were able to buy and sell this, even if the kind of economist solution of putting a price on pollution or something was right, people would probably sell it for a pretty low price and sort of be subjected to many of the same kinds of harms that we see today.
Mm. Well, you brought up labor, so I feel like it's a very natural moment to talk about labor as well. Let's start broad. How are you trying to examine the question of labor through the lens of the free gift?
Yeah, in a couple of ways. One is that to think about how labor itself is can be a free gift, and this is, I think, in two ways. So one, there are a couple of chapters that deal with labor, and one is thinking explicitly about what's we usually talk about as reproductive labor, and the Marxist feminist critique of unwaged reproductive and household labor, and why these kinds of human labor tend to appear as free gifts. But then I'm also interested in the ways that Marx talks about actually human cooperation and even in wage labor as a free gift in some ways, and the ways that basically when people cooperate and they coordinate with one another, and do, engage in what he talks about as like social labor, you can just do a lot more. You kind of unlock these different capacities, whether it's by like, coordinating some kind of labor process so people are spread out across a lot of space, or doing things at different times, or, just basically just doing things that are more than the sum of their parts that like no individual person could do, but you can kind of organize yourself such that new things become possible. Those new capacities, he says, again, he says, like in a capitalist system, these like are all captured by the capitalists. They get basically like this like free gift of cooperation, but that's actually a thing that people could do in any other system too. And that we could all kind of benefit from that gift a bit more. So I'm interested in both, like, if I try to think about both how labor and the coordination of labor can be, kind of a gift in its own right, but also how capital has to organize labor very carefully and precisely to try to maximize that free gift. Like capital is always trying to like maximize the productivity of labor and organize labor in the most efficient ways, and make it so that again, kind of gift of cooperation is as large as possible. and that ends up the way that that happens, nature, sort of these like non-human entities and the qualities of different kinds of natures and the biophysical processes that are part of different kinds of production, like whether you're making like steel or growing corn or whatever it may be, matters a lot for like how much you're able to like hyper coordinate and organize labor and unleash these incredible gifts of productivity. And our model of labor, or of like capitalist labor, is the kind of pinnacle being in like the industrial factory, like the Fordist plant or something like that. And Marx talks about industrial production as kind of the pinnacle of capitalist production. And I think it is, in the sense of it's like this like end point or something, but it's not what a lot of labor and production looks like. A lot of things never get all the way there, and I think are unlikely to. And it's not, and that is in large part because of the kinds of physical processes they involve and the kinds of natures and natural agents and gifts of nature that are part of those production processes, are very difficult to organize in ways that are like hyper efficient and productive and mechanized and all of these kinds of things. So I think it's a slightly unusual way of thinking about like labor and nature, because it's also like, what is nature doing, or what is labor doing to nature? It's not like, oh, look at how labor is like destroying the environment or something like that. It's more about how needing to organize both the human and non-human elements of production. Like when we think about that as a concrete process, we can start to see a lot of differences in these different like modes and sectors and industries that are about that human and non-human interaction, and what kinds of again, efficiencies or gifts that they unleash or make possible.
Mm. And it again gets to this sort of the rot of pricing in the form of wages, where it's like, on the one hand, capitalism by design has to exploit. That's how the capitalist accumulates wealth. But then
Yeah.
also applying a price to those unwaged or sort of non-productive forms of value, that's not the right move either, because that's going to bring about more forms of destruction, that like echoing what we're already seeing. And you draw from a number of sort of legends in feminist theory, and I think that
Hmm.
they really help us kind of reflect on these issues in ways that, again, unfortunately don't as often appear in books critiquing capitalism. So talk to me about what you're pulling in from folks like Sylvia Federici, Simone de Beauvoir, Donna Haraway, and so on.
Yeah. In general, I would say the book is very, definitely very strongly informed by Marxist feminism as like, I don't know, a way of thinking. And it actually began trying to think through this parallel between the unvalued, like, um, gifts of nature and what Marxist feminists talk about as the unwaged work of the household, and the critique of unwaged household labor and domestic labor, and then the demand of the wages for housework movement, of wages for housework, or to wage those kinds of work, which is actually not so much a demand for like paying them as to draw attention to this unwaged space and politicize these activities that had been taken for free and treated as lacking, not real work and not serious sites of political struggle. And so I think so I'm trying to basically investigate like why, again, like why is this parallel? Why do we see this kind of same analogy and parallel being made by so many feminists and ecological thinkers? Like what accounts for this? Why are these kinds of labor treated kind of like they are part of nature? And what I get from, I think, Federici and Beauvoir and others is a way of, definitely a way of like politicizing these kinds of labor. And more generally, I think I take from a lot of that work this general impetus to look at, I guess, spaces or sites or practices that are often neglected in work on capitalism, that are seen as like outside of capitalism, or not fully integrated into it, or not relevant to it, which is what I think a lot of domestic work had often been seen as, kind of like not really relevant, not really capitalist. And so so it was kind of disregarded for a long time. And so to say, well, like actually there is something important here. We need to understand these. We need to understand these, like how these overlooked things have been shaped by, in some cases constructed by, like organized by capitalism, and also how they're important for capitalism. And so I think I take that general thrust, um, and urge to understand these like spaces, these things that like lack value, these like valueless things. Um, where I do differ from Federici and some of the wages for housework, but also broader, I think, analysis of social reproduction in particular, is in the explanation I want to give, which is that I think the usual explanation of why reproductive labor isn't waged or isn't economically valued has to do with how we see it or understand it, with something of the kind of like ideological resonance of those kinds of work, that we don't think of them as work, and so we don't value them as such. Um, so it's kind of, it is kind of an ideology critique saying we need to change our view, we need to change our perspective. The wage can help us see that these are actually work. And I think that's an important political move in a lot of ways, but I also do think it ends up putting too much weight on our ideas and ideologies and like our perceptions of the world, and doesn't account enough for the ways that um, I think, it suggests that if we just saw work differently, then we would value it more. If we saw housework as being more valuable, then we would value it more, for instance. And I'm just not sure that is borne out. Or I think that is probably just not true. And what I try to do instead is to look at the like actual labor processes and treat reproductive labor as basically continuous with other kinds of work. Be like, yeah, it is work. It's like pretty much any other kind of work. A lot of other kinds of work used to not be wage, and then they were sort of drawn into the sphere of wage labor, have been waged, have been reorganized by capital, have been subsumed, as Marx describes, are now like, very much kind of integral, or like kind of very integrated into capitalism as a system. But why those and not why not reproductive labor? Can we answer that in a way that isn't just about like our perceptions or something like that? And the argument I'm making is that it does have to do with these different kinds of processes that are at work in the work of reproducing human life. That there are that this is kind of like a work of nature in a way. Like our bodies are these physical entities, like reproducing life, whether it's at the level of like taking care of children, or caring for somebody who is ill or disabled or something like that. It means responding to all of these sorts of physical things that happen on their own timelines, or not on the like production cycle. You can't just clock in and clock out, and that's like, and then nothing happens at the end of the day. As the wages for housework texts always say, like a mother's work is never done. And there are a lot of kinds of work that are like that when it comes to the reproduction of like literal human life, and that these end up being very labor intensive. They're very hard to make more productive. They're very hard to squeeze extra value out of. They're hard to sort of coordinate in this way that will again unleash these like massive productivity gains that the capitalists can capture the profits from, and sort of enjoy. And so it ends up being this low growth or productivity sector that a lot of capital is not that interested in investing in, and just kind of ignores. And that's another argument of the book. It's like a lot of things, we have to pay attention to these things that capital is kind of ignoring or abdicating or neglecting and leaving alone, and not only to the things that it's like absorbing and bringing into its direct control and orbit. That it's equally important to attend to these things that are just kind of being sort of shunted aside, and that those are also being remade by capitalism, even if in a different way.
Right. Like, in fact, as you point out, capitalism is then pressurizing the ideology to say, oh, that's women's work, because there's not a way
Yeah,
to make it valuable under its own terms. It's then creating ideologies that then further harm people.
yeah, and if we don't have another way to do it, then if capital kind of neglects it, just leaves it up to who, someone else, then there are going to be like institutions that sort of emerge and ideas about who's supposed to do that. And there obviously are a lot of old, long-standing ideas about what kinds of about gendered labor. Like, I don't want to say that's not important. I just think it's not the driving force of what's happening in a capital society in the same way that our other ideas aren't the driving force either. Like, that's not what's making like, I think if a capitalist was like, wow, I can make a ton of money off of like paying people to do this labor, they definitely would. They wouldn't just say, well, that's not real work, that's women's work, so I'm going to ignore it. Like, I just think that's again, orienting us too much towards this power of the idea rather than these sorts of compulsions to make money in whatever way possible.
Mm. So one other sort of thing, not exactly connected to this thread, but I also really appreciated your examination of what the hell we mean when we talk about nature. And I think there's again a dotted line to this. It's not a direct. It's not a solid line. Could you talk about what you're examining with this question of what do we even mean when we say nature?
Yeah. Nature is such a tricky word and concept. It is what Raymond Williams was described as the most complex word in the language, and I think it's definitely up there on the complexity scale. It is a really complicated word that I think people have used in many different ways. There have been critiques of how we use and understand nature forever. So it's always like tricky to get a handle on, because there's one sense in which nature is kind of like the whole everything in the physical world, like just like everything that exists. Things that aren't supernatural, right? Like, it's not ghosts and spirits, whatever. It's like the tangible physical material world that we exist in and live in. Often nature means everything that's not human. So like, it's the antithesis of like the human or the cultural or the social. Sometimes it means like these like spaces of supposedly untouched or more like distant from human settlements. You're like, oh, I'm going to go into some nature for the weekend. I'm going to go hiking or whatever. I'm going to get out into nature and like go out into some away from more intensive human society. And so there's all these things. There's often like a very moral valence from the way people talk about nature. Like, it's natural to do this. It's a good thing. If something's unnatural, it's like frightening and wrong and bad and like, deviant in some way. And I think all of these things get mixed up together. And certainly there have been many critics, including Williams himself. Raymond Williams has this great essay called "The Idea of Nature" that's like basically just about how much we project human society and values and culture onto whatever we call nature, and we say, oh, look, there's nature. It's and he's like, obviously it's like red in tooth and claw on the one hand, and then it's like a kind of this harmonious, beautiful coexistence on the other. And it's obviously both and neither. Like, it's not one or the other. There's so many different kinds of like beings that make up our world, and they like exist in really different and weird ways. And none of them are something that you can just like map onto human society. So we certainly need to kind of get rid of this idea that like what is natural is good, or is something that we should take a model from or instruction from. Because whenever we do something like that, like say like um, this is, I don't know, when Donna Haraway gives these great examples of like the way that the Museum of Natural History used to organize like the primate hall, be in these like little nuclear families, as if like like, oh, look at the, like, this is how like the primates all live. Like, it's natural to be in like a little like two parents and two kids family, and that's what we should do too. And like, whether or not some, probably some animals out there probably do live in something like that, but that doesn't mean that we follow that, because we also don't then like follow the ones that eat their young or whatever. So there's like there's an example in nature for like anything you would want to support or argue for. And the historian of science Lorraine Daston has a great book on this too, where she's just like, you know that's, you can always kind of counterpose it with a different nature. And so I think we have to really let go of the idea that natural has any kind of like moral valence, or like any kind of sense that we should it's how we should do things, or it tells us something about how we ought to live. But I do think we need to be very, very attentive to like nature in the sense of the physical world, of which we are a part. And then we need to be really interested in that, and curious about it and trying to understand it and understand how it works and how what other kinds of beings need and how they live, or in some cases maybe don't live, maybe they don't even like living, it's like a non-organic process or something. But that it's really important to understand all of those things and to try not to try to like separate that out a bit from this kind of like um, question of like the ought, like what does that tell us about how we ought to be. um, and so I try to mostly use nature to talk about that question, like the sort of sense of like the physical world, and sometimes try to use like non-human nature to to talk about the world other than ourselves, or like beyond the human, even though we're also obviously integrated into and part of nature in some way, as many environmental thinkers have pointed out.
Mm, thank you. So we've sketched, and I truly only mean sketched, some of the issues and research that you've jammed into this book. I want to spend the final moment of the conversation getting into some of what you view the responses to be. You resist overt prescriptions, but you do offer some really potent points of consideration. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some ways we should be, like, upon confronting these ideas, what the free gift tells us and what we can learn from the free gift about what appropriate responses to kind of start to maybe get out of this mess a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, it is something like that doesn't have prescriptions in it. In part because I think I've just written a lot about what I think we should do in climate politics elsewhere, and so wanted to kind of do something different with this book. Um, but I also wanted to leave that. One of the arguments of the book is that this should be, a lot of these questions are like ones that I think should be open to us. Like, how do we respond as a society to something like climate change? How should we transform our lives, our infrastructures, our, the ways of, I don't know, eating or moving around, or how we patterned our lives at every level, from the kind of, daily meal to the occasional vacation. Like, all of these things people have argued need to be up in the air and we need to rethink them. And I think that's true. But I don't want to say, and there, ergo, we should do X, Y, Z. I think the point is much more like, part of the reason we can't make those decisions is because we are trapped in this form of capitalist unfreedom. Like, we don't really have the leeway to make these decisions. We can't really just decide, oh, we're going to treat nature as like super valuable tomorrow. Like, it's just not possible. And so, I think the first thing I want to just emphasize in the book is that, like, it's almost like, I guess, like a negative solution or something, or just like, we can't respond to or address these problems through a lot of these kinds of market tools that have been very dominant for the past 40 or so years. Like, they're just both, I think, practically speaking, very unlikely to be implemented and work at the scale we need, but also, like, they are not going to address this fundamental problem of decision making and of like the overall treatment of nature as a free gift, even if you can patch up like one kind of externality here and there with a tax on this, effluent, or that kind of smoke or whatever. So like, this broader problem is going to persist in this broader structure of decision making, where we're, again, these like alienated individuals making decisions on our own that are aggregated and producing outcomes that nobody has chosen and that nobody has consciously said, like, this is what we want to do, and everyone feels kind of helpless in the face of, like, that will continue. So to just say, like, that is we have to really emphasize that those aren't going to work, and whenever somebody says, oh, let's just put a price on natural capital, be like, no. Not just because it's like wrong, but because it's also like not going to solve the problem. But then I also do think, there are places where I try to at least look to things that I think people are already doing or have done, or places where I see at least like moments of kind of struggle, or ideas that we could try to develop into something else, or try to start, like, kind of building out. And one is, thinking about not, in the chapter I'm thinking about the valuation of ecosystems, to not just think of ecosystems as turning them into commodities as a lot of this kind of like put a price on nature and then make nature into this like new asset class or something you can invest in. But rather that like actually there's something more like infrastructures, and we should treat them as such and not like in a way where it's just like totally utilitarian and we're like um, instrumentalizing nature, but that like, we all rely on these things. Like we should make these decisions like, collectively about like how we live together off of like what ecosystems we need to be providing services of like, again, like water filtration or carbon sequestration or biodiversity preservation or any number of other things that are all like really important and have a lot of concrete entailments to them. And that thinking about those is also going to mean, well, thinking about like, okay, well, if we want to preserve this wetland, because it's like really important for blocking storm surge coming off the Gulf Coast, and it also it's like all this like cool wildlife that lives there. That means we probably can't drill like more, we can't dredge it for more oil and gas pipelines. We, can't bulldoze it to build another like housing development. So once you ask these questions, you start opening up a bunch of other ones that I think are ones we could make. I think often those kinds of decisions about trying to preserve, elements of ecosystems that are doing things that we really need will end up impinging on decisions we make, even if you live in like, a place like New York, as I do, where it seems like, nature has already been transformed. But, if you take the bus, you are putting a lot less pressure on the rest of it than if you're driving around all the time. So, I think something like Zohran Mamdani's Fast and Free Buses is like very much in line with how you could think of, well, if we see ecosystems as infrastructure and we see our infrastructures of life as connected, both the kind of biological, biospheric to the more traditional kind of like transit kind of things. These are all parts of like how we make our lives together. And so how can we imagine how we might do those in ways that promote collective flourishing for humans, but also for non-humans. And so, yeah, so there are a bunch of places where I try to gesture to things like that. And the last thing I guess I want the book to do is to just like remind us that, or just like find some places where people's judgments and intuitions and their own senses of what's valuable actually do cut against like what we see in the form of pricing, because I think there's so many places where people are like shocked and appalled that whether it's that like childcare is paid so poorly or like not paid at all and valued so little when it's such an important activity of human life, or that like these rainforests that have incredible diversity of life forms that exist nowhere else on earth, and creatures that will potentially go extinct forever, and all of these that have provided indigenous peoples with like food and medicine and all these kinds of things for generations. So all of these things like have basically no value at all relative to like the beef cattle that might go and graze that land, right? So I think there's a lot of places where we're like, how can that be true? Something is wrong here. And so trying to like catch those places and help people see like, I guess like have that perspectival shift that like, yes, something is wrong. And this is what it is. Like we need to understand again something more about capitalism as a system, and stop expecting even the things that have a price to be priced correctly. That like even waged labor does not reflect like the social value of that labor. It does not reflect like something about what is what we think is socially valuable or necessary. That's not how we should think about what these numbers mean, and that can maybe help us kind of be a little more critical in general of these sorts of fetishes of prices and wages and so on.
Value and values, as it were.
Yes. Exactly.
Cool. So hopefully this makes for an invitation for folks to read the book, because again, we really only scratch the surface. I have 3 questions I like to close all my interviews with. You've inevitably answered these to a certain extent already, so feel free to bring those answers back in or take it a totally different direction. The first is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Well, coming from political theory, I guess one thing is just is a lot of this like economic stuff and like economic policies that I think people have often thought of as either boring or like just bad. Like these sorts of policy schemes for valuing nature or for pricing this or doing that, and more generally this entire kind of field, because I think, I mean, it often is kind of boring to read a lot of the stuff, and often I think the things that they're proposing are kind of are morally troubling, or like just something that seems like really off about them. But I think, we have to kind of go into the thick of things, and see like what are the mainstream discourses. Like I've had people ask me sometimes like, well, why are you even studying these guys? Aren't they all like horrible? And you're like, well, some of them are, but like it's pretty important because they have like set the tone for how we do think of like environmental and climate policy. I mean, more generally, like how we think about like what the tools and mechanisms of politics are for like decades. And so we need to kind of get in there and try and understand what they're saying, and engage with it and have a critique that's both like, a critique that is a strong one, but then also that recognizes like what are they getting at here? Like what is this problem? How can we understand it in a different way, and hopefully like a deeper, more interesting way. So yeah, that's, I mean, maybe that's a broad one, but yeah, I think just like getting into these, into to like economics and like mainstream economics, like boring and like things like that are like not like cool heterodox economics, so people should also do that. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. I had a friend once in talking about a totally different category of thing, where people were like, oh, but I don't want to have to like read or like watch the videos of the people that I think are stupid. And she was like, well, presumably Marx didn't feel very good about capitalism, but he sure knew a lot about it.
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
yeah. What is one resource you would recommend for making better sense of reality?
I feel like this is hard, and my answer is going to be annoying because I was just going to say like Marxism, but like it's kind of just true. Like I think I feel like it has been still, and people are still like, why use Marx for like climate stuff or environmental stuff, and it's still just like the most valuable tool for understanding capitalism, and ergo for understanding the transformation of our entire planet by this, system that now dominates the whole world and all of our lives. And it's funny because I think I originally was much more like like, I guess like Marx skeptic socialist or something, like where I was like, well, there's so, people go around, they're like, well, just like read Marx and it'll answer all your questions, and that kind of mode of like there's he has addressed every objection or like question or problem, and I don't think it's true in the sense again of like that you can go and like read Marx and be like, oh look, he talks about like carbon emissions, although he does talk about a bunch like so many things that you would not imagine, but um, more just because I feel like in general nothing has helped me understand more what I think is happening in what's what's happening in the world, like why things are happening the way they are. Um, uh, Understand these problems that, I started studying capitalism because I wanted to understand climate change and understand like how to do something about it. And like, I feel like I've gone deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole where like then you end up writing a book about like nature and value. So maybe that's like also a cautionary tale. And yeah, I just feel like that has I went down that rabbit hole because it was, it was just like clarifying. So I don't know, reading Capital, I guess, and then going from there.
See how far down the rabbit hole you go.
Yeah.
And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
This one is in some ways I feel like my origin point of tearing climate risk stuff, which was spending time in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, when I spent like 6 months volunteering with Common Ground Relief, which was like the kind of mutual aid collective doing like relief work in New Orleans after Katrina. And I was there for several months, and I was like 19 at the time, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, just living in this city that had been completely decimated, where, the state was totally absent. Like I, as this, kind of idiot teenager, was like running basic services. It was a really eye-opening experience that was very surreal a lot on the level of like daily life where you're just like, where am I? What is, what is my life right now? And you're like walking down these streets that look like they've been like bombed out because like all of the houses are just destroyed and empty, and you're trying to like get someone to deliver a pallet of water to this location, whatever. A lot of just like crazy stuff happening all the time. Um, but but so there's a unreality of it on that level, but it's also just like a very like the world does not work the way that I have that I thought it does, that I was sort of like taught it does. I need to really drastically reorient my understanding of the world, and that eventually led me to like thinking about Katrina and thinking about natural disasters and the Gulf Coast and the oil industry, and all these things eventually kind of led me on a long and winding path into thinking about climate politics and capitalism and all of these other things. So it's been, again, like a long journey of trying to understand reality and what is going on, which is a tough thing with climate, honestly. Like climate change is such a epistemically difficult issue problem. Like it's this thing you can't really see, you can kind of feel, you can like sense happening in some ways, but even the sort of sensory experience of it, you have to have like a full, you have to have a way of understanding that and making sense of that, that is usually kind of based on some other kind of knowledge or something you've learned about how the world works, scientifically at least. And then like if you want a more causal or a deeper causal explanation, you have to really just like understand a lot. So I think getting to reality is tough. I feel like I'm still on my path of trying to do that.
You and me both. And yeah, I guess to respond to that last bit about climate change, we're in the perhaps last moment where we could even say something like that. Like I've been thinking about that a lot lately, how I think like climate denialism is about to plummet, just as the realities make themselves, undeniable. But it definitely feels that way every day for me as well. So I appreciate hearing you say that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see. I think I hope you're right. I think you're right that like denial of it as a phenomenon will plummet, but then the like why is it happening? We'll see where people go with that, and I think we'll
Fair
probably
enough.
have all kinds of crazy explanations. So
Yeah.
yeah,
We are the
but
country of Pizzagate, after all.
yeah, that's right.
Well, on that note, I just want to thank you again for this book, Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. Everybody should go read this. I hope this conversation is an invitation to it. And thank you for being with me on Urgent Futures.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.